Welcome back. This is Genes, Development, and Behavior, Part 2. So let me scroll over to my PowerPoint. All right, so we've talked about Hox genes that contribute to development, and changes in those Hox genes can contribute to a change in development. We've even seen that perhaps small changes in one or two of the Hox genes have been associated with, in humans at least, with autism or autism spectrum disorder. And now we're going to move on and talk about the context in which genes are expressed influences development as well. And there's a word here that we should learn, and that is polyphenism. Polyphenism. This is one example of what we would call phenotypic plasticity. Phenotypic plasticity basically means when a phenotype can be different in different conditions. Okay. Polyphenism is an example of phenotypic plasticity. And the basic idea here is poly means many, right? The same genotype produces more than one phenotype. If you are genetically similar, you could follow different phenotypic pathways, if you will, because of environmental cues. So let's look at some examples of polyphenism in several different animals. So we'll first think about honeybees. Honeybees are pretty interesting, genetically speaking. And what we've got at a honeybee colony, of course, is we've got one queen who is fertile, and she is producing millions and millions of eggs, right? She has two sets of genes, so she's diploid, just like we are. And she produces workers are females, like the nurses and the workers that go out and collect food. They are female also, but they're sterile, typically. And that is, they can't make their own eggs. And they also are diploid, so they have two sets of genes. And then there are also males, because this is a sexually reproducing animal. The queen makes haploid males. Haploids have only one set of genes. So the female bees have two sets of genes. Male bees have just one set. And they're called the drones. And they basically are alive to reproduce. And that's it, right? They donate sperm to the queen. The queen uses that sperm to make offspring. Okay. But the question is, who becomes the queen, right? Who becomes the queen? We've got, let's see if I can get this set up here. We've got a female embryo. And sometimes that female embryo can develop into a worker. And sometimes that female embryo develops into a queen. The female workers and the queens are not genetically that different from each other. A female embryo can develop into either a worker or a queen. Not because of one's genetic code. It's what happens to this little egg as it develops, all right? It's the environment that the embryo is placed in that determines whether this female embryo will become just one of many workers or the queen, right? Which developmental pathway she'll be coming. So typically, embryos that are destined to become a queen are put into a special compartment, okay, a specially developed compartment, and then they're fed a special diet. It's all about the diet. They're fed what's called, and you may have heard about this, it's kind of popular actually to eat, it's called a royal jelly. And You might not want to know where it comes from. Apparently it's made by the salivary glands of nurse worker bees. So they make this incredibly rich royal jelly that the egg is like swimming in. So the embryo is just growing and developing in this royal jelly, all right, if you will. And eggs that develop in this royal jelly go on to become queens. What do you mean by that? They go on to become morphologically different than the workers. They're bigger. They are fertile. They are behaviorally different from the worker females. They're going to act like a queen. They are going to aggressively defend their position, essentially, of being the queen, preventing others from mating and others from laying eggs at the hive. They're going to act entirely differently than a worker. Why is that? Because of the environment in which they were raised. They were raised as an embryo swimming in a beautiful royal jelly. And that royal jelly determined the development of the embryo and determined the embryo's pathway, if you will. Okay, so there's phenotypic plasticity here with a, essentially genetically identical egg can develop into a queen. People who own hives know this, and they figure out how to make more queens. All right, here's another example. Another insect, the geometrid moths, and here's its species name if you want to see that species name. Turns out the geometric moths have caterpillars have two different forms. So remember, in a moth or a butterfly, you start out with an egg that develops into a caterpillar, and the caterpillar grows for a while. It undergoes, it becomes a pupae, and it undergoes metamorphosis to become the moth or the butterfly. Well, it turns out that in this species there are two different forms or two different phenotypes of caterpillars. One of them looks like the topped form, and one looks like the bottom form. One of them is kind of cute, really, isn't it? Knobby, wrinkled caterpillars, and one of them looks a little bit more twig-like or stick-like, kind of gray-green, different color. These knobby-looking caterpillars look a heck of a lot like what are called catkins that are found in oak trees. They're the flowers of oak trees, the male flowers, if you will, of the oak trees. Now, let me tell you the rest of the story. It turns out that geometric moth females lay 2 broods of eggs every year. They lay an early brood, okay, and they lay a late summer brood. So an early brood, early spring, early summer. And this early brood hatches, and after it hatches, the larvae begin to feed. And they feed on the pollen of those catkins. And that pollen is rich, right? Pollen is very rich, and as they develop into these fuzzy, cute catkin-like. They look a lot like catkins, catkin-like caterpillars, and because they're hatching early and developing into catkin-like caterpillars, this is actually beneficial to them because the trees at this point are flowering and have catkins, and so predators don't see these catkin-like caterpillars very easily because they look just like the plants that they're living on. It's a great camouflage. On the other hand, the late brood develops into larvae, and these larvae don't have any catkins to feed on. The catkins are all gone. These larvae start feeding on the leaves, kind of the not old, but they're older leaves of oaks, okay? So these guys feed on leaves, the oak leaves. And it turns out the oak leaves are really rich in what are called tannins, kind of a poisonous substance, actually. And they don't develop to look like catkins at all, right? They look like those weird stick twig-like caterpillars, if you will. They look very different. They look much more like where they live. Where do they live? They live on the twigs of oak trees. They look very different. They're not as big. They're not as likely to do as well, but they still often survive, and they themselves go on to breed later on. So they're still somewhat successful. So we've got very, very different offspring from the same female moth, right? That lays both of these broods. What's going on? These two broods have followed a very different phenotypic pathway. In the end, they do develop into the same types of moths. What happened? It has to do simply with their diet. The animals that feed on tannins within the first 3 days after they hatch will develop into these twig-like caterpillars. If you don't feed on tannins, you develop into the catkin-like caterpillars. So an environmental difference has a huge impact on what these caterpillars look like and how they act and what they eat. I mean, it's crazy, okay? And how successful they are. Why not just skip? It turns out these twig-like caterpillars develop into moths that aren't as successful. But from a female's perspective, the female could just breed once and lay one set of eggs, or she could lay 2 sets of eggs and maybe get a few offspring that are successful from this second set of eggs. So it's beneficial for her to lay 2 sets of eggs, or 2 broods, if you will. Okay, well, bees, moths, they're not super interesting, right? Are there such examples of polyphenisms in animals that we're a little bit more familiar with? Any mammals or anything even closer related to us? Yes. Check out the Peter Pan orangutans. So back in the 1800s, a guy named Wallace saw these orangutans. They live in Southeast Asia. He's actually a cousin of Charles Darwin. He co-founded evolutionary theory by natural selection. Probably don't hear about him very much. But anyway, Charles, he thought that he saw these orangutans, and he thought they were really interesting because most of the males, some of the males looked like the guy on the bottom here. Big flanges here, these big patches or flaps, and lots of hair, right? Big guys. And by the way, male orangutans are much bigger than their female counterpart. And then he saw these guys. These are also males. We call them Peter Pan males, actually. They don't have that look at all. They look like juveniles, but they could be as old as 20 years. They could live as a Peter Pan male for up to 20 years. Wallace thought they were a totally different species. What's going on here? We've got these 2 different forms, if you will. The Peter Pan males never seem to grow up. They're smaller, they have less hair, they have a smaller face. They can stay small for years and years and years. What's happening? Well, it seems that there are 2 strategies that have evolved. And here's, you have to know a little bit about the social structure to understand these 2 strategies. So the social structure goes something like this. There will be likely one large dominant male in a given area, and then there'll be some subgroups where you've got a female living with kind of her relatives. All of her offspring, the ones she's still nursing, the ones she's weaned, including male offspring, etc. Okay, so you get this kind of big group like that. The bigger male is kind of the defender. He will fight other big males. He will compete for access to the females, and he will mate very rarely, but he mates with females when they're ovulating. So he's going to mate when they're the most fertile. Then there are these little guys. These Peter Pan males have a different strategy. It's actually called the sneak rape strategy. and that language isn't used regularly anymore. So what they'll try to do is essentially sneak up on females and mate with females all the time, whenever they can, just whether or not the female is ovulating. So they will, try to sneak in, try to sneak a mating here, sneak a mating there, even when she's not ovulating, even when she is not essentially consenting. And that's why they call it the sneak rape strategy. He's not very successful. Once in a while he might sire an offspring, but it's pretty rare. Okay, this guy over here is much better at siring offspring. But there's two strategies, and they look very different. What's interesting is if the big male dies or if he leaves, one of these Peter Pan orangs will then develop very quickly into the dominant male in the area. Again, two different phenotypes. Does it mean they're genetically different? No. Peter Pan orangs have the ability to become dominant males. They don't, because they're in a different environment. The environment determines their phenotype as much as their genes determine their phenotype. Their genes are limited or expressed in the context of the environment. And when you're living in an environment with a dominant male, probably things like there's pheromones, there are other hormonal changes or hormonal developments in these Peter Pan orangs that prevent them from developing into a dominant male. Pretty interesting though, huh? Okay, in the next video we'll take a look at maternal effects as the context that can influence development as well. Okay.